June 4th, 1943. A train pulled into Railroad Street in the small town of Mejia, Texas. Inside, a man named Uniffizier Vera Burkhardt held a pencil with a trembling hand. He was a German prisoner of war, and he was writing in a secret diary. What he saw through the window that night was something that would have earned him solitary confinement if his own officers had known. He wrote that the Americans must be lying. He couldn't believe his eyes. Through the glass, Burkhardt saw something that flatly contradicted years of Nazi propaganda. It was 10 o'clock at night, yet electric lights blazed from every farmhouse, every street corner, and every shop window. It was an endless constellation of electricity stretching across the vast Texas plains. Back in Germany, blackout regulations had plunged the entire country into darkness since 1940. Even before the war, electricity reached barely 20% of German farms. Yet here, in what he was told was a collapsing nation, electricity flowed like water. There were 1,850 veterans of the Africa Corps stepping down from that train. These were men who had fought under Rommel, the Desert Fox. They expected to be treated like the prisoners they were, but they didn't step out of cattle cars or freight wagons. Instead, they walked out of cushioned Pullman coaches with dining services and sleeping berths. The entire population of Mejia had turned out to watch them arrive. What the townspeople didn't know was that this moment was the start of a profound psychological transformation. The collapse of their ideology had actually begun weeks earlier, on May 13, 1943, in Tunisia. General Jürgen von Arnim had surrendered hundreds of thousands of German and Italian soldiers. These were the Wehrmacht's most experienced desert fighters. Among them was Hetman Friedrich Radke, a holder of the Iron Cross. His diary, found decades later, would tell the story of how American industrial capacity shattered every assumption these soldiers had about their enemies and their own cause. The journey to revelation started in the port of Oran, Algeria. As Radke and 30,000 other prisoners waited for transport, they saw American efficiency firsthand. The U.S. Army processed thousands of men daily with a level of precision the Germans hadn't seen even at the height of their power. Identity cards were filed, medical exams were completed, and inoculations were given. Most shockingly, American officers explained their rights under the Geneva Convention in fluent German. But the real shock was the food. Hans Müller, a soldier from the 21st Panzer Division, wrote to his mother months later about his time in the cages at Oran. He said the Americans fed them better than they had eaten in 6 months of active combat. They were given white bread, real coffee, and meat twice a day. At first, the prisoners thought it was a trick, a piece of propaganda designed to impress them. They didn't realize this was just the standard American military ration. Then came the ships. The Liberty ships that carried them across the Atlantic were monuments to American production. One ship, the SS Robert E. Peary, had been built in just 4 days and 15 hours. If the Germans had been told this, they would have dismissed it as an impossible lie. These vessels were being produced at a rate of 3 per day. Rather than sailing back to America empty after delivering supplies to Europe, they carried up to 30,000 prisoners a month. During the 2-week crossing in July 1943, the psychological demolition continued. Kurt Zimmermann of the 90th Light Division kept a detailed account of what he saw on board. He watched as the American sailors threw away more food waste in a single day than his entire company had received in weekly rations. He saw them toss half-eaten steaks and gallons of milk into the ocean. He wrote that they didn't do it to mock the prisoners. They did it because, to the Americans, this abundance was normal. their supply was limitless. The ships were like floating classrooms. The prisoners learned that the vessel carrying them was just one of thousands being built. Each one required 250,000 parts manufactured across 32 different states. Lieutenant Colonel Wilhelm von Stobern, a man from an aristocratic Prussian military family, watched the radar antenna rotating above the bridge. He believed this technology was a secret only the elite possessed. Seeing it on a common cargo ship made him realize for the first time that Germany had already lost the war. When they arrived at Norfolk Naval Base in Virginia on August 2nd, the sight shattered any remaining propaganda. The base sprawled across 4,300 acres. Docks stretched for miles, and cranes loaded dozens of ships at the same time. In a single day, this one port handled more tonnage than the entire German port of Hamburg managed in a week. Johann Weber, a former factory worker, counted 47 cargo ships being handled at once. He noted that the cranes moved with electric power, smoothly and without the coal smoke that choked German cities. As the prisoners marched toward the trains, they passed parking lots filled with hundreds of cars belonging to ordinary dock workers. In Germany, owning a car was a privilege for the wealthy or high-ranking party members. The people's car, promised by Hitler, had never actually reached the people. But here, the laborers drove themselves to work. This was a level of wealth they couldn't comprehend for the working class. The trains themselves were the next surprise. They weren't the 40-and-8 wagons, 40 men or 8 horses, that carried troops across Europe. They were luxury passenger cars with padded seats and white tablecloths in the dining cars. Hedman Radke wrote that they boarded like tourists, not prisoners. An American sergeant even apologized because the air conditioning in one car wasn't working perfectly. The Germans had believed air conditioning was a luxury reserved only for Hitler's personal train. The 3-day journey from Virginia to the camps in Texas and Oklahoma was a turning point. As the train rolled through small towns like Martinsville and Danville, the prisoners pressed their faces against the windows. Every town was lit up. They saw factories running night shifts with parking lots full of cars even at midnight. The guards told them this was normal, that every American town had electricity. Muller, whose father was a Nazi party leader, called the guard a liar. The guard just shrugged and told him he'd see for himself. In Roanoke, Virginia, the train stopped for supplies. The prisoners watched as railway workers used automated loaders and electric pumps to service the train in 30 minutes, a job that took 2 hours in Germany. They saw the workers drinking Coca-Cola from glass bottles and throwing the empties away without a second thought. They saw them smoking cigarettes and stubbing them out halfway finished. To the Germans, this magnificent waste was proof of infinite resources. As they crossed into Tennessee, they saw the Alcoa aluminum plant. It stretched for 3 miles along the river. Its furnaces consumed more power than the entire city of Munich. Near Louisville, they passed synthetic rubber plants that had been built in just 18 months. Germany had invented the process, but America was producing nearly 7 times more rubber than Germany's best year. A chemist among the prisoners, Erich Hoffmann, saw the distillation columns and knew immediately that Germany was outmatched. The train passed by Ford's Willow Run plant near Detroit. This single factory, built in 9 months, produced a B-24 Liberator bomber every 63 minutes. It was larger than the city of Cologne and used more electricity. A Luftwaffe pilot named Hutman Worley counted 17 bombers in various stages of completion from his window. He had been told American planes were inferior and hastily built. Seeing the precision of the assembly line changed his mind instantly. The deeper they went into the American heartland, the more the myths fell apart. In St. Louis, they saw barges on the Mississippi carrying more grain than the entire German harvest of 1942. They saw grain elevators that could feed a city for months. Carl Schmitt, a farmer's son, wrote that Americans transported food like it was ammunition, in endless quantities. He watched a crane operator eating a sandwich with more meat than a German's weekly ration. In Kansas City, they saw massive stockyards with tens of thousands of cattle. The smell of meatpacking plants filled the air. These soldiers, who had lived on tiny rations in Africa, watched American workers eating beef sandwiches for lunch. "They ate meat like we ate bread," wrote Paul Fisher. One guard bought 20 hamburgers for the prisoners at a station stand, paying with a single dollar bill. This wasn't a special occasion, it was just a Tuesday for the Americans. When they finally arrived at Camp Hearn in Texas, the conditions were better than what many of them had known as civilians. There were wooden barracks with electric lights, hot showers, and steam heat. The camp hospital was better equipped than most German civilian hospitals. They had penicillin, a miracle drug the Germans had only heard rumors about. They saw American doctors using it freely, even for minor infections, while German soldiers were dying for lack of basic medicine. The camp kitchen was another shock. There were walk-in refrigerators and electric mixers. The daily ration included fresh milk, eggs, meat, and vegetables. Otto Krebs, a former hotel chef from Munich, wept as he was forced to throw away perfectly good bread because of American regulations that required a 10% surplus. He couldn't wrap his head around discarding food in a world where his family back home was starving. By the fall of 1943, a labor shortage meant the prisoners were sent to work in fields and factories. This was the final blow to their ideology. They traveled through the heartland without blindfolds and saw everything. They saw the endless cornfields and the shops full of goods. At a cotton gin in Houston, Herbert Lang watched a machine do more work in an hour than his entire village could do in a month. The farmer who owned it wasn't a party elite. He was just a regular man with a truck, a tractor, and a radio. In Nebraska, prisoners worked in sugar beet fields. They saw a single combine harvester do the work of 100 men. The farmers spoke of yields that were double what the best German land could produce. Wilhelm Hoffmann wrote that the farmer's 16-year-old son drove a tractor worth more than his father had earned in a lifetime. When he mentioned it, the boy just laughed and said they were waiting for a better model to arrive soon. Even though they couldn't work directly on war machines, many prisoners worked in support industries. At a Campbell's soup factory in New Jersey, they saw production lines that processed more tomatoes in a day than German factories did in a month. They saw women and elderly men running the entire plant while the young men were away at war. One elderly woman managed controls that would have required 50 workers in Germany, and she did it while drinking coffee and listening to the radio. Near Detroit, they saw the River Rouge complex, which employed 100,000 people. It consumed more electricity than the city of Hamburg. Franz Keltner wrote about the parking lots filled with thousands of cars. He was told many workers owned 2 cars, one for work and one for the family. In Germany, even officers rarely owned a single car. The prisoners began to suffer from what intelligence officers called ideological collapse syndrome. They stopped arguing about statistics because they had seen the reality. The camp newspapers, written by the prisoners themselves, started to change. They stopped talking about national pride and started talking about democracy and post-war reconstruction. Lieutenant Hermann Goetz wrote in a letter that they had been told America was a weak, divided nation. But every day he was there, he saw the most organized and powerful nation on earth. He realized they had been told fairy tales by criminals. Perhaps the most unexpected blow was the kindness they received. After Italy surrendered, Italian prisoners were treated almost like guests. But even the Germans were treated with a humanity they didn't expect. Christmas 1943 saw American civic groups sending 500,000 packages to their enemies. Each one had cigarettes, candy, and games. In Mexia, a church choir sang carols in German for the prisoners. Boy Scouts delivered handmade cards. This Christian charity toward an enemy was incomprehensible to the Nazi mind. Walter Mueller, who had lost his brother in the bombing of Hamburg, wrote that these people showed them genuine kindness even though their own sons were off fighting Germans. He realized that only a people who were absolutely certain of their victory could afford to be so secure and merciful. The Christmas dinner of turkey, ham, and ice cream was more than even German generals were eating at the time. By 1944, tens of thousands of prisoners were taking classes. They studied English, history, and science. The University of Chicago sent correspondence courses. They found libraries with millions of books and discovered that American science was years ahead of theirs. They read American newspapers and saw that people were allowed to criticize the government. Joseph Kramer wrote that in Germany, criticism meant death. But in America, it was considered a patriotic duty. As they worked in the arsenal of democracy, the numbers became undeniable. At a boat factory in New Orleans, they watched workers build 700 landing craft a month. They saw women operating heavy cranes and welding hulls. Kurt Zimmerman wrote that everything they were told was impossible was happening right in front of them. The factory produced more boats in a month than the entire German Navy built in a year. At a steel plant in Ohio, they saw 10,000 tons of steel produced daily. This single plant outproduced the entire Ruhr Valley at its peak. Paul Hartmann, who had worked for the German giant Krupp, said the scale was beyond imagination. He saw more steel wasted in spills than his old factory could produce in a day. The American workers complained about having to work overtime while producing mountains of materials. The 1944 harvest was the final proof. In Kansas, they saw wheat fields that looked like golden oceans. The grain elevators held more wheat than Germany imported in a year. In California, they saw fruit orchards that stretched to the horizon. They watched as fruit with minor blemishes was thrown away. Fruit that would have been a luxury in Germany. They even saw crops plowed under to keep prices stable, a concept that shocked men from a country where people were starving. When the news of D-Day reached the camps in June 1944, the prisoners knew it was over. Seeing the footage of 6,000 ships and 11,000 aircraft convinced them that their homeland was being crushed by a force they could never match. Friedrich von Stauburn wrote that they had challenged the world's greatest industrial power with nothing but mythology and horses. They had sent rifles against automatic weapons and courage against unlimited resources. One of the most lasting impacts was the medical care. German doctors worked with American staff and saw techniques they had never imagined. They saw prisoners receiving surgeries that would have been reserved for the elite in Germany. They saw mental health treated with counseling instead of punishment. Dr. Friedrich Bauer wrote that the Americans treated the human being, not just the soldier. This humanity revealed a strength the Nazis never understood. When the war finally ended in May 1945, the prisoners were shown footage of the concentration camps. Many didn't believe it at first, calling it propaganda. But as the evidence mounted, the moral collapse was complete. They realized they hadn't been warriors for a great cause, they had been tools for a criminal regime. Walter Schmidt wrote that they thought they were bringing civilization to the world, but they found that they were the ones who had become barbarians. As they prepared to return to a destroyed Germany, the Americans didn't just dump them back. They gave them vocational training and taught them how to rebuild. They learned about the Marshall Plan before it was even announced. They realized America wanted to help them rebuild rather than punish them. They were being transformed from defeated soldiers into the citizens who would build a new democratic Germany. Between 1945 and 1946, over 370,000 German prisoners were sent home. They returned to a land in ruins, but they carried something more important than supplies: the knowledge of how a free industrial society worked. Many of these former prisoners became the leaders of the German economic miracle in the 1950s. They became ambassadors, leaders of the European Commission, and pioneers in agriculture and industry. Hans Kroll, a former prisoner, later wrote that they learned prosperity comes from freedom, not conquest. They saw that democracy created wealth, and that treating workers well increased production. The lessons they learned in those Texas and Nebraska fields became the foundation of the new West Germany. Historians now look back at this as one of the most successful re-education programs in the history of the world. The program didn't work because of clever speeches or posters. It worked because of reality. Every full meal, every electric light, and every working toilet was an argument against the Nazi way of life. They were converted by prosperity and dignity. Out of more than 370,000 prisoners, fewer than 1% even tried to escape. Most were happy to stay, and thousands actually maintained friendships with American families for the rest of their lives. In 1985, hundreds of these former prisoners returned to Texas for a reunion. They brought their families to see where their transformation had begun. Hans Via, who became a doctor in Maine after the war, spoke about finding dignity in the camps. Kurt Meyer talked about how American farmers treated them like sons rather than enemies. They realized that the Americans weren't weak. They were just secure enough to be kind. The final word of that reunion came from Hermann Goetz. He told the crowd that they had arrived in America as enemies and believers in a lie. But they left as friends who had seen the truth. He said America's true weapon wasn't its bombs, but its capacity for creation and its unshakable confidence. They returned to Germany with a mission to build a society that could create rather than destroy. The story of these prisoners is a story of how a free society wins. It wasn't just about outproducing the enemy in tanks and planes, though America did that on a scale that still seems impossible. It was about the power of example. By showing their enemies the fruits of freedom and the power of human dignity, America didn't just defeat an army. It transformed a generation. Those soldiers who once trembled at the sight of electric lights in a Texas night became the architects of a peaceful and prosperous Europe.